Tonight, the topic is artificial intelligence is killing labor, but don't blame the robots. This is a phrase or a sentence crafted by Bob Love, and it's taken on new meaning for all of us. And tonight, I hope that you'll gain something from coming. Speakers, they will interrupt each other at will, but the rest of us will need to get the floor, and I'll be glad to grant that when I can. So they'll speak most of all, but we'll also have the opportunity to at least ask questions and maybe to briefly interject our opinion.
My name is Malcolm Harris. I'm a professor of finance here at Friends University. We're happy to host you all. And let's see, I teach finance and whatever else the boss tells me to. Comment on economics and been an expert witness and I don't know what else. I talk.
I'm Patrick Riley. I'm a Catholic priest. I'm a priest in Arkansas City, Kansas, but I grew up here in Wichita.
Bob Love. I'm a member of a family that's been in Wichita a long time. We were all in business together. My grandfather started the business, and my dad came and ran it for a generation, and then my brother and I jumped in. And so we have a lot of experience in business questions, how businesses work, good and bad experiences. I mean, everyone has an interest in business, but since we sold the company, I've had time, for the first time really in my life. My wife and I, my wife is here, so I got to answer all the questions carefully tonight. But we had 4 kids, and with a business, you're just very busy. And I had time to think after I retired, and a lot of what I'm going to express tonight are thoughts that are just starting really to take shape, and it's not really something that happened years and years ago, but all of those experiences are now kind of coming to the surface for me, and I'm really feel privileged to be here tonight. I asked John and Mike and others over time, and I'll let you know, I'm trying to find my voice publicly so that I can share some of the things that I'm thinking about, because I have children, I have grandchildren, and I really think that it's a message that needs to be heard, but I have to practice on some ones so that I get good at it. So you're my group. Thanks for coming. And thanks to Friends for hosting us tonight. It's really nice of you.
My name is Josh Shorter, and I was invited by John to come and speak. And I just have to say, when John was in high school, he told everyone he wanted to be a comedian. But who's laughing now? I work for a small manufacturing firm. My dad decided to start his own company making airplane parts on September 11th, which was not a really great day to start an airplane business, as I'm sure the economists at the end of the table would tell you. So we've had a lot of work coming up with the right way to run things, and we intend to be good corporate citizens and treat our employees right, as well as invest in capital that helps us be more efficient in a very, very competitive marketplace. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Glad you're here. Quick correction, Becky, did I call you Mom?
It's okay.
No,
It's okay.
that's her maiden name. She's married to Phil Elder. My apologies. First question, gentlemen. Business friends clamor for lower taxes. Capital has been very cheap. The ability to employ robots is obviously real and growing. Are humans fighting a losing battle with machines and artificial intelligence when it comes to the job market? The march toward high levels of automation is accompanied by what kind of music? Are humans fighting a losing battle with machines and AI when it comes to the job market?
Michael, first, I have to say, I'm very conscious of the effect of 9/11 on forecasts. I was forecasting revenues and bios for the Postal Service on that day. That was my job. That's what I was doing around that time. That particular event, plus anthrax in the mail the following month, threw up my forecast by $6 billion. All right. First,
And gentlemen, you don't have to go in order. Just speak at will. If you can pass or whatever.
first answer is no. And except everybody get a cake in their neck if I show them, but I have a series of slides. I think we have a real serious problem of men not working. There's a book out by Nicholas Eberstein, and the Cato Institute had a book session with him as the featured speaker talking about his book. And I could show you a series of slides, but he has some great set of slides.
I got the time wrong.
I thought you were on your bicycle and someone hit you.
No. Somehow 7:30 got stuck in my head, so I was taking my time and dropping something off at the office when the phone rang. So
No worries.
my apologies.
We were ready to place you.
Anyway,
Russell, the first question is, are humans fighting a losing battle with machines and artificial intelligence when it comes to the job market?
anyway, if you look at the labor participation rate of men in the United States, despite some ups and downs, it's been falling almost steadily since the 1940s. There are 7 million men without without high school degrees, who are between the age of 25 and 54, who are neither working nor looking for work. Apparently, some of them are home playing video games in their parents' houses. I guess their mother hasn't been able to kick them out yet. Some of them are older, on disability or whatever, and if you take white men in their 50s, so one demographic group in the United States that actually is having their life expectancy shortened instead of lengthened, which has been the trend in virtually every demographic group in the United States. The employment to population ratio since 2000 has been going down both for men and women. So even though the unemployment statistics tells you everything is peachy rosy, dandy, whatever little adjective you like, the actual number of people working as a percent of the adult population, or for that matter as the percent of the population between 20 and 60, is well below where it was before the last recession and way below where it was before the recession before. I think that, and we have a number of people here who started businesses or involved in starting businesses and have started businesses. Through most of our post-war history, we've had more businesses created than go out of business. In recent years, for the first time since they've been keeping those statistics, we've had more businesses going out of business than starting up. And large companies will find ways of not paying corporate income tax, will find ways of issuing bonds and taking advantage of crazy low interest rates we have that Mr. Love, I'm sure, will excoriate the Fed about. Small businesses are not doing, obviously are not doing terribly well because we're not having enough new ones to offset the old ones, and historically that's where 80% of the jobs come from. My own recommendations, I don't know if we want policy recommendations, is that we get rid of the payroll tax, get rid of the corporate income tax, replace it with a 20% value-added tax, which among other things would give Mr. Trump his 20% border tax without violating our treaties, and reorient the incentives in the system. There's a bunch of other policies I think we need to do. But we need to work is important not just as a source of income, but as a source of, as a vocation, as a source of meaning in life and a source of creating society. And work is disappearing. And I don't think it's because of robots. I don't think it's because of AI. Although if you talk with people in Silicon Valley, they much prefer a technology solution to a human solution. I just had this conversation in January with a venture capital type in California. And finally, related to all that, there are so many men, particularly young men, who aren't working. I think we've got the same kind of imbalance in our society that the Chinese are facing, where there's, a different kind of imbalance. We have lots of good women and not so many good men to marry them. And I think that has long-term consequences. Recently, someone started talking about this subject, and they asked me as an economist, and I said, well, I misquoted George Stephanopoulos, and I said, it's the culture, stupid.
Others? Is it a losing battle?
Is it a losing battle? No. Is it an unfair fight? Definitely. And the reason it's not a losing battle is because ultimately labor won't lose. Ultimately labor won't lose because labor has numbers, and the numbers will overwhelm because that's the way God designed us. We are individual people. I want to remind, Malcolm is an economist, maybe a macroeconomist.
Most of the time.
Is that fair?
Often.
Macroeconomics is based on statistics. The distinction between macroeconomics and microeconomics is what we do each day when we get up in the morning. And if what we do each day when we get up in the morning is right and true and good, certain things happen in the larger world about us. And those things that happen work themselves out through the economy, through the neighborhoods, through the communities, through the cities, through the states, to have effects. And the effects that they have are what statisticians and micro and macroeconomists study, because they believe that if you just intervene to help economics using political force, that you'll correct all of the problems that the microeconomic world suffers from. And that's us, and that's every laborer who gets up to go to work in the morning. So we have this tension between people who say, I'm going to do what's right, and other people who say, I'm going to control the outcome of his actions. I want to stop there and see, are we getting the distinction between micro and macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is fundamentally invokes political force. All right? Think about that. Macroeconomics fundamentally invokes political force. Now, Malcolm might argue with me and say that's really not a fair branding of macroeconomics. I want to read to you just a brief sentence from the opening paragraph of John Maynard Keynes' major work that brought macroeconomics into the 20th century. And I've added a couple of things to it, but it's basically his statement, summarized. He said in his book, and the book is titled General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Listen to that. The general theory of employment, interest, and money. What is John Maynard Keynes telling us there? That employment, interest, and money have something important to do with each other. Correct statement? All right. Here's the thesis of his book. And Malcolm's probably read the book, I haven't. Okay? So this is unfair, and he may come back and comment on it later. But here was Keynes' opening statement. I shall argue that the specific postulates of the classical microeconomic theory, that's Adam Smith, upon which I was brought up, his mother trained him in these things. These are things a mother can train her children to do. These are common sense things that God put into man and into the economy that we can all participate in. I shall argue that the specific postulates of the classical microeconomic theory upon which I was brought up are misleading and disastrous if we attempt to apply them to the general facts of our experience. What is that saying? It's saying that it's not enough to do what's right every day and leave the outcome and the results to what Adam Smith called an invisible hand. Adam Smith didn't say it was God, he said it was an invisible hand. All right? We're not happy to do that. Some people want to manipulate the results. They want to manage the results. They want to control the results because the results are not satisfactory unless they are immediate satisfaction and immediate gratification. And what I'm going to argue tonight is that labor has been sucked in and duped to its own disadvantage by allowing government which is supported by macroeconomic intellectual theories to subvert its money and interest. This is Keynes, employment, interest and money, right? To subvert its money and interest, and by so doing, destroy employment, which is the very heart of labor. And that it's a self-inflicted injury, and that as soon as labor understands what it is permitted to be done to itself, it will come back and demand that the government and the macroeconomists take their hands off of money, make it honest again, let interest rates return to what God intended them to be and what they would be without interference, and that at that point we will once again have a level playing field between capital and labor, and the battle won't be a battle anymore, it will be a partnership. And I'm going to argue that, and that's a lot to argue tonight, but that's just my opening statement, okay? And I'm going to pause and let some of the other fellows speak now.
As usual, Bob has presented an accounting of history that I find myself in great sympathy with, even though the way in which he arranges the facts of history point, I think, in a direction very much away from the actual topic today. Go back to your opening statement on Keynes, which is, it's actually a good book. It's a good book. You should read it. And that opening statement, I like the way that you dig into it, but I think you emphasize the wrong words. He's talking about, as you quote, the general facts of our experience. What is the general facts of the experience that Keynes was observing? These are post-industrial revolution facts. These are post the emergence of finance capitalism facts. These are post the first great wave of globalization facts. He is addressing the reality of a marketplace that is profoundly different from the marketplace that existed in the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th century, the 16th century, and so on and so forth. He is talking about the idea that these old microeconomic postulates cannot address the reality that is being driven by the demands of people who enter the market. The people who own firms are looking to expand their scope. They're looking to lower their labor costs. They're looking to take advantage of the expanded situation that technology and increase in communication and increase in labor flows was making available to them. We live in Keynes's world. We may not like it, but we live in Keynes's world. We don't live in Adam Smith's world. We live in a globalized world. We live in a world where pretty much everybody has a smartphone. You know, I don't. I still have a flip phone. Some of you might have flip phones, but looks like pretty much everybody has a smartphone, and they like it. They like it that way. They like the access to the instant gratification of information. People like being able to buy the stuff from Amazon because they like the instant gratification of that rapid delivery. That's the kind of world that we exist in. Again, you know, going back to Malcolm's comment about the culture being at fault here, we have a culture of gratification. We have a culture of profit. And so we are going to use the realities that the Industrial Revolution, that finance capitalism, that globalization has put before us. There are good principled arguments to not do those things, to look for a change in our culture. And I think a change in our culture in those regards probably would lead to a more level playing field between labor and capital. But so long as our consumerist desires are in the driver's seat, then capital is going to be able to define the terms of the conflict because they're the ones that are going to be able to make use of the globalized systems that we have available to us to maximize delivery, to maximize profits, to maximize returns on investment, none of which is particularly good for the wages of working people, but all of which presents us with smartphones, which we enjoy very much.
I would say that there's one thing that you're missing, Russell, and that is when you say our, you're talking about a very narrow segment of Western civilization. There are billions of people who don't have cell phones. There are billions of people who are born with a lifetime of energy to work and have very little or menial work at best. If you want to talk about a global picture, then you're going to start to see that what you said is only happening because the Western part of the world has used its control over money to manipulate and exploit the entire globe because of basic and fundamental failures in culture. I agree with that. However, if fundamental economics, microeconomics were once again established and respected, because I believe that fundamental microeconomics is God's plan, and man took his hands off it and stopped managing outcomes, we would indeed begin to see microeconomics healing that larger world, because it would prevent and it would stop and hinder this aggregation, this super consumption, overconsumption that we're witnessing, that is part of what's happened since the America's ascendance, certainly since the end of World War II, when America began to flood the world with its dollars under the Bretton Woods Agreement. So, there may be some other people who want to jump in here. I eventually want to get to this drawing because I think it's going to bring this home really strongly.
I guess I can maybe interject like a theological, thing.
That's why you're here.
You know, I guess when Bob talks about that economics will fix things, Pope Francis critique in Laudato Si. His critique in Laudato Si was one part the culture, but I mean more fundamentally it was a forgetfulness of God. And that was the fundamental corrective that has to happen in culture, because he sees that, yes, Western culture is forgetful of God, but so is the rest of the world. The developing world is quickly forgetting God. He's very negative on technology. I don't know how many of you read that, but he's very negative on technology because he sees technology as something that manipulates people. It's something that you turn into its slave rather than it being a tool, and it begins to move the heart away from God, and it enables you to really put man as its own God, as God. And so man then begins to dominate and control, which then leads to, fitting in here, this desire to control the world. So Pope Francis, in some ways, is very different than Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, because he's almost advocating, hit reset on everything. Hit reset and go back to something very different, because he's saying it's not working. It's not working, for what it's worth.
Is it working, John?
To answer the question that you asked, though, I think that there are plenty of very smart and trained economists out here at MIT, for example, who would argue that actually we're not innovating fast enough for labor. That the reason that we have a wage problem in the United States is actually because real wage growth, which has not increased since the 80s, is because of efficiencies, not because we have not had efficiencies in our processes, not because AI is taking over. I think the bigger problem from a political perspective is that, so you have four kinds of work, basically. You have cognitive, which could be split into manual and repetitive and non-repetitive, and you have manual, which can be split into repetitive and non-repetitive. And the way that capital is designed is to replace the repetitive work in both of those segments, cognitive and manual. So what you have is a flood of open labor. And you have the labor that in the past, like, for example, we all know the story of the Luddites, for example. In the past, those people could easily move from one industry into another, whereas now all industries are advancing at roughly the same rate. So what you really have is you have a flood of labor to the bottom of the wage pool, and you have more labor in the top of the wage pool, and what's left out is the lower to upper middle class. Those are where we're seeing wages that aren't increasing. That problem, a lot of it has to do with manufacturing, which I would argue has nothing to do with AI. It has to do with outsourcing. We have a lot more risk of losing jobs outsourcing than we do to robots right now. Whereas in the past, you would then move just to a different industry. You can't do that anymore.
So, sorry, Josh, just so I understand, are you saying then that most jobs, the cognitive repetitive and the manual repetitive, are going away because of capital efficiencies?
I'm saying that what happens with advancements in technology is designed to replace the repetitive jobs.
The repetitive, both the thinking and the doing.
What has happened throughout all of history, and what a lot of economists would argue is no different today, is those jobs that are being replaced with capital is allowing those laborers to complement. Capital is designed to complement labor. It is not actually designed to replace it. For example, ATMs were designed, and a lot of people thought that they would put traditional bank tellers out of business. And what ended up happening was you had a lowering in a bank branch, an average of 20 people in a bank branch before ATMs to 13 after. So it seemed like there was a loss of that labor in the United States, and there really wasn't, because we increased the number of bank branches by 49% because it was cheaper to operate a bank branch. So that market, that labor market actually grew with the result of that innovation. As one example. I brought many. I'll save some more of them.
I feel at this point I should just chime in, if only to defend my honor.
I would never impugn your honor.
He's just going to impugn your discipline.
You know what they say
Just your
about
life
you know what
career,
they say about statistics, right? I mean, you live with statistics. There's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics. You're a statistician.
Now, that's a real nasty accusation.
Final statement on this question before we go to the next.
Well, it's just a general qualification. Now that I've been tarred as a macroeconomist and a statistician, I'd like to point out, by microeconomics, what I think of is what are the incentives, how do these affect behavior, and to what extent can we predict it, and to what extent can we marvel at it? Macroeconomics talks about how things like money and interest rates and so on affect things. As a macroeconomist, I'm more like Hippocrates. Did I pronounce his name right?
Yeah.
Do no harm. And I try to identify places where there are policies which are doing harm. And I think corporate income tax and the payroll tax are doing a great deal of harm. I think when your biggest trading partner makes decisions that are political rather than market-based, such as when China decided to cut down half of their North China's industry before the Beijing Olympics, and it winds up doing tremendous damage to your manufacturing sector, then those type of things are diseases which I think a good economic physician should identify the diseases and suggest cures.
I couldn't agree more.
And Donald Boudreaux, who is at George Mason, said all good macroeconomics is microeconomics, and I think I'm of his school.
I agree 100%. And if can I just beg the panel's indulgence to just briefly cover this so that we have.
Do you think it would be a separate lecture, Robert?
No, it's not going to be a lecture. Does everyone have a copy, or can you look at it just quickly? Who doesn't? Is there any extras laying around?
Class.
No, it's not a long
Russell was just
class.
hoping if you didn't step until 7:30, you would have already gone over this.
Okay. Malcolm just said macroeconomics is microeconomics. Is that what he said?
I quoted Donald Boudreaux that
Yeah.
all good macroeconomics is microeconomics.
Okay, all good macroeconomics is microeconomics. I couldn't disagree with that. We also had Patrick who said the Pope is troubled by technology. Is that an accurate statement?
That's an understatement.
The Pope is troubled by technology. And Josh said, and I was trying to keep all this in my mind, that, and this is incredibly important, and this is what dialogue does. It brings truths together. Josh said, you correct me if I'm wrong here, labor and capital should not, in God's mind, although you didn't mention God, but I'll mention him, be in competition with each other. They should be complementing each other. Was that an accurate representation?
Sure.
Okay. With that, I want you to look at the simple little top line on this graph. This is God's primal equation in economics. If you don't understand any economics, this equation is the only thing that you need to live by. It's got all kinds of variations and all kinds of depth behind it, but man's material well-being, and Patrick will acknowledge, I think, that man does have concern about his material well-being. His spiritual well-being is also important. But his material well-being is a product of natural resources. That's a gift. We didn't make those, right? Any questions about that? Created. Natural resources plus labor times tools. Tools here for that word tools, you can substitute capital. Is that fair? You can substitute technology. Is that fair?
For tools?
For tools.
Sure.
Technology. Here's why. Where do tools come from?
Man's mind.
What?
Man's mind.
Okay, but if man is really busy bending over and picking up stuff to eat and killing animals because he's on a subsistence level, how is he ever going to get to the point where he can develop sophisticated tools?
Savings, forethought.
What?
Savings. Forethought.
Savings?
Yes.
What is savings? Somebody tell me what savings is. You're an audience now. I'm a laborer, and I don't understand what savings is. Tell me, what is savings? Where does it come from?
Stored
What?
labor.
What?
Stored labor.
Stored labor.
Foregone consumption.
Come on. There. Foregone consumption? Foregone how long?
Well,
How long
Maslow's,
it's
yeah.
necessary.
Okay. That's what-
Maslow's hierarchy would argue that you can't get to self-actualization and creation and all of the things you're talking about if you don't have physical safety and well-being.
Okay, so you
gotta make it up that.
so you have to have physical safety and well-being. What does the word surplus mean to anybody?
Well, it's what's wants and what's needs.
What's wants and what?
You have needs, you have to eat, and you have to provide for some safety, but if you have a little bit more crop that you've planted or whatever you've done.
A little
or
more.
you want to go spend it for some wants, you don't spend it, you save it.
So if you have a little more than you need, you have a surplus. Surpluses result in savings. That's what surplus is, right? And with savings, a person can actually not work while he's developing what?
Tools.
And what are the tools going to multiply?
His work.
His work. Now, isn't that cool how God would figure that out? Okay?
See, but Bob, I think you're making a false dichotomy here. You're saying only man's material well-being is benefited by his work, but man isn't just material. He's a spiritual and a material being.
So work benefits him spiritually as well.
That's correct, but his ability to do work is a function of his spiritual capacity.
Oh, okay.
He can't reason. He can't invent tools unless he has reason, which is a spiritual power. So he's not able.
I'm not arguing with that at all.
Right. So that's a gift of God.
So it's a gift of God too.
Right. But this ability to take the natural resources and make something in them, to have a creative capacity, is perfective of man. It
Is
helps
also
his
a gift.
spiritual quality. Yeah.
But could you agree that we wouldn't see tools develop unless we had some kind of surplus so that our basic fundamental needs were met, so that we had time and opportunity to develop tools? These companies that develop tools, they can go for years and years and years with no income. Someone has to be providing lots of savings for them to do this. Is this resonating with people? I'm not arguing
but
against.
surplus isn't the only component in this, though.
No, they have to have the imagination. God has to give them the gifts to invent the tools and discover the tools. Absolutely. But my point is that one of the things also that they have to have is savings. They have to have the ability to earn more than they can produce. It's simple. The Apostle Paul said it in here it is. I mean, it's right here in the scriptures. That was basically Paul's theory of microeconomics. Here it is in a nutshell. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer. I think he was talking to the politicians and the crony and the crony capitalists. Anyone who steals must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with his own hands, that he may have something to share with those in need. Work, something to share. That's surplus. Paul is defining surplus right there. He said that he could produce more than he needs. The extra is surplus. In Paul's case, he says share it with someone. Now I'm going to take a big leap, okay? And I'm going to take a big leap over into Corinthians, where Paul explains what this sharing of surplus, how it works. And it's in Corinthians chapter,
Your wife's here.
yeah, 2 Corinthians. Someone who's a Bible scholar, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, maybe.
Okay.
And he says, my objective is not for you, when you give this to the person who's in need, I don't want you to be in want. I want there to be an equality, so later they can give it back to you. That is a brief description of finance. I know it seems like a stretch, but I'm telling you, the Apostle Paul presents a theory of employment, and he presents a theory of finance, because advancing something to someone when they're in need so that they can give it back to you when you have a need, that's what finance is all about.
Peter Brown wrote a really interesting book about the divine economy and about the idea between this exchange between the physical goods on earth and then the spiritual goods in heaven. And he used that verse that you're talking about, that there's a long history in Judaism and Christianity, especially early Christianity, that the wealthy had an obligation to provide for the poor, because the poor then would pray for them. Because in God's plan, according to the Bible, at least as the early church fathers read it, the poor were privileged because God had taken pity on them, and they were given special intercessory powers, but simply by their poverty. And so the wealthy were able to store up treasure for themselves in heaven by providing for the poor, and then the poor, by praying for these wealthy people, their benefactors, then they stored up treasure in heaven. So it wasn't it wasn't like you give me money today so that I can give you money tomorrow. At least that's not the Pauline sense.
Okay,
of it.
and I can accept the fact that charity is not built into Adam Smith's microeconomics, but Adam Smith did talk about an invisible hand. He said there is a hand that will keep this in balance. And that's the last thing I'm going to say. I want you to see that hand here, because I want you to see that labor here in the big blue box, okay? Look at labor. What does labor do with its surplus? Labor creates savings, right? And savings are what all these companies need to build their tools. In fact, savings are what the government needs to wage its wars. Savings are incredibly important in the microeconomy. Where do savings come from? They come from labor. Labor has to be able to earn a surplus if there's going to be savings. If there are no savings, there will be no capital investment. And if there's no capital investment, there won't be tools, there won't be technology, there'll just be labor. In God's plan, the microeconomic plan, and Adam Smith's invisible hand, God put in a protection for labor. And if we would observe it, we would see that labor becomes the only legitimate source of savings, and that without savings, look at capital over here. Without savings, capital goes nowhere. All right? Now, see these little boxes in red: wage rate, interest rate, price level. Those are variables that keep this God-given microeconomy in balance. They go up, they go down. All right? And last thing I'm going to say right here. The government comes in, starts to print money. By the way, this is total and abject immorality. It's counterfeiting. It's theft in the most brutal sense of the word. But the macroeconomist justifies it by the fact that, hey, we don't like the results of our microeconomic world, so we're going to just change it. We're going to print money. The United States embarked on this in 1972 when Nixon took us off the gold standard. Ever since then, it's been wide open with the presses. But here's the point. When the government steps in and starts to print money from thin air in the form of either currency or fiat credit, it pushes down this interest rate over here. The minute it pushes that interest rate down, two things happen. The guy who was an honest laborer before that happened, but coveted a new pickup truck that he couldn't afford, goes out and sins and buys the pickup. And he feels real good about it. Oh, he feels a little guilty, but yeah, go ahead.
Maybe question 2 will help us focus back on question 1.
Amen.
Can we go ahead? Yeah. Can we please move to question 2, please?
Bob, make a concluding comment. Just one more.
The guy buys his pickup truck, and at the same time his employer buys a machine because the cost of capital came down, right? 6 months later, the guy's employer comes to him and says, "I'm sorry, we have this new machine. We don't need you anymore." He's got a debt in a pickup truck. His employer has a new machine, and the guy can't afford to pay for his truck, and he can't afford to consume. We have a depression.
Thank you, Bob. Well said. Very well stated. Question number 2. Workers in business pay taxes that fund government responsibilities. Yet corporations and business insist on the need for lower taxes. But should we not tax their robot laborers? Aren't government welfare checks, in essence, paying the taxes of robot laborers who are not currently taxed?
The value-added tax would tax both of them equally.
Explain that to us.
A value-added tax, instead of taxing things called profit and things called wages and so on, each business takes what they buy from other businesses and other organizations, subtracts that from their revenues, and the difference, which is basically the return to labor and capital, is what they pay a value-added tax on. The 35 countries in the OECD, we're the only one that doesn't have a value-added tax. Under GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, under the World Trade Organization, under our treaties, you can impose a value-added tax, which is uniform for anything that comes in the country. And if I did my numbers right, I'm not as good a statistician as I'm accused of. We're now down to a point where of what we sell domestically in terms of manufactured products and what we export in terms of manufactured products, 85% of the value added is actually imported. Manufacturing jobs in the United States since 2000 have gone from 19 million to 11 million. And I think that's in large part because of the distortions of our tax system, the distortions of our monetary policy, of macroeconomic distortions and microeconomic distortions, which have caused the market to give the wrong signals to the right people.
Anybody else want in on that?
So I guess I'm saying yes, you tax robots, but just by changing the tax system.
I think the question would be, what would be the purpose? Like, what's the end goal? You know, economy is driven by incentives, right? Like, just the other day I was reading an article about a basketball player who shot 194 three-pointers over the season, but he didn't take one in the last 5 games because in his contract he had a $500,000 bonus if he made 35% of his three-pointers in a season or more. And if he missed one, he was going to drop below the 35% threshold. So like what his employer was probably intending him to do was actually cause a negative outcome for the employer. And so we have in economy negative externalities, which would, in this case would be robots dislodging workers from the workforce, when historically, and I'm talking about for all of history, like exactly the opposite has been true. With technology, we have more workers coming into the workforce, not less. Workers are benefited by employers and businesses investing in technology. So actually employees on the whole suffer if we don't invest in technology. So the question is, what would taxes are usually used as a negative, like instead of, we're going to tax robots so that instead of employing robots, you'll employ humans. So that slows down the growth of the economy. It slows down our production rate, and it it causes the exact opposite effect of what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like nobody would want to go back to the days of the horse-drawn carriage and having to use sail-powered ships to get your fish and things like that, you know, and use whale oil lamps and that sort of thing. I mean, we're happy for electrification and you know, solar power and wind power and all the other innovations that, you know, been coming along, even if some of them are a little bit, you know, subsidy driven. But I mean, it's just ridiculous to think that you should tax a person for having a car, which gives him to work, you know, so he doesn't have to spend so much time traveling, and so he can be much more productive, or a typewriter or whatever. It doesn't make any sense to tax the tools that make a person more productive. I mean, that just hinders innovation. So, I mean, and that would be one of those incentive issues, right? So, I mean, nobody imagined people developing video games and apps for phones and things like that even 50 years ago. And we cannot even imagine anything of what's going to be, what kind of jobs are going to be for people in the future. And people, whenever they find out what those new jobs are, people will get trained for them. They'll go to work for companies. You know, not everything can be done by machine, and we'll find new things that only people can do.
Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I mean, there's a little bit of a critique there, I guess, that Pope Francis would have, at least. And that's the reason why he is so critical of technology is because he sees that technology is one, it allows us to put ourselves, like I said earlier, in the place of God, that we dominate the world, that we then refashion the world in a way that's apart from God. But the other thing that he sees is that then we become slaves to it as well, because then it just simply is feeding our desires in the sense of like apps and games and things like that. It becomes something more of just pure recreation, just pure consumption versus something.
Say the same thing about alcohol and that sort of thing. You know, that it can make you feel like a god, and you can definitely overconsume it and that sort of thing. I mean, people have to be responsible. You know, it's up to us to teach people morals. But God originally said, "Go and have dominion over the earth." That's what He wants us to do, is to rule over the earth.
Yeah, like in so Pope Francis would say in a co-creative way. So he uses the image of the garden a lot. So he goes back to Genesis and he talks about how when man was given that command to work, to be fruitful and multiply and to work, to have dominion over the earth, that was pre-fall. So man was meant to, in a sense, be perfective of the garden. Bishop Robert Barron, some of you may know him, he wrote a really neat commentary on the second book of Chronicles, and he talks about how King David's reign is in a sense, a anticipation of the restoration of Eden, of the garden, that David gathers in the tribes of Israel, he defeats the enemies of Israel, he brings peace and prosperity to Israel, but in the end, sin is what undermines David's kingdom, and it's anticipatory of the reign of Christ. So again, it's that co-creation, that union with God that has to be restored since the fall. So in the theological, I guess, view, in the view of man as body and soul, sin is what's going to undo all of these things. So you're always going to have to contend with sin. You're always going to have to contend with bad choices that people make. And so, man has a destiny, right? And so that has to be taken into account as well.
What does an economy look like when God is properly positioned in men's minds?
Well, so the Catholic, this is the compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. We have a whole book on it, and this is just kind of a summary of all the documents of the Church, really since Rerum Novarum, which that was Pope Leo XIII. He was dealing with very different problems than we're dealing with today. He was dealing with that real division between capital and labor. And so Karl Marx's response to the problem of capital and labor, of course, was communism. And so then the church is coming in with this third way. this other way, and it starts to articulate these principles. So some of the major principles of Catholic social doctrine are subsidiarity, so the idea that a higher power should not do something that a lower power can do.
Economic decentralization.
Well, not just economic,
Just
but even
gonna echo.
social, but even social decentralization.
Social decentralization.
Because, so for example, if you have, let's just take something silly like a dog club, okay? So if you have a dog club, a national dog club shouldn't control everything. You know, you should have a local dog club too, and there should probably be some intermediate dog clubs in there as well, because a national dog club can't attend to the needs, nor should it attend to the needs of the local dog owners, because we each have a capacity to do creative things, to control the things. So subsidiarity, solidarity, it's the idea that the human race, we're one, we're in solidarity with one another, so we ought to be united. I am my brother's keeper, so I need to look out for him. The other principle is the universal destination of goods. So Bob kind of hinted on that with this idea of natural resources being a gift. So the earth is given to everyone. So there's a universal destination of goods. There's also the common good. So it's the sum total of all the goods that are necessary for proper human flourishing. So the things that you need to be a fully functioning, fully alive human being. So that's going to include like education, healthcare, safety, the right to work, because you have a natural right to work. But in addition to these kinds of rights and principles, the Catholic social tradition talks about obligations too. So you have an obligation. So there's an obligation to participate in society. You are not allowed to check out of society. You have an obligation, a moral obligation to participate. You also have a right to participate in society. So it's not right to disenfranchise people. And not just politically, like in the sense of being able to vote, but even to have a voice, to have a right to contribute to society. And you have an obligation to participate.
Can I go back to your principle of subsidiarity?
Sure.
Okay. Did you hear what he said? Because it's vital. He said, what a individual can do, the state should not do. Now, the Pope has issued that as a principle of godly economics. Okay? What can the individual do in terms of savings? We've already seen he is able to save. And not only does he have a right to save, does that sound strange? To say that someone has a right to save? He has an obligation to save. And if the individual fails to exercise his right and obligation because it is usurped by a higher level like a Federal Reserve, what are you going to get? What do you get? What does the Pope say that you get when you start to violate the principle of subsidiarity? Instead of the individual saving, who is fully capable of doing it, he can live a life where his needs and his wants are balanced, and he earns and he saves a surplus. But if he lives a life where he does not do what his God-given ability to do, which is to earn and to save, and that power is transferred to a higher level, is that going to result, does the Pope think that's going to begin to result in some kind of imbalance or corruption? Because that's exactly what I think we've got happening.
So what we call it, at least what the popes in the last probably 100 years have called this, is what they call it a social sin. So they say it's a system that is wrong. But they make the important distinction that there's no collective guilt. That social sins are always made up of the individual sins, the individual wrongdoing of others. So, they talk about like the social sin of racism. But there's not a general guilt on all people. It's individual racists that are creating things that are racist. So, or you could have a socially sinful government, right? A government that is doing something wrong, right? maybe oppressing,
Violating that principle of
taking
subsidiarity.
away the rights of people, let's say to vote, right? But it's not the general, it's not everyone in that nation, it's the individuals that are doing sinful things that are perpetuating that.
Quick consult to elucidate something.
A question? How quick?
Just really quick.
Really
Okay, just to elucidate Bob's point, it used to be that people could put money in the bank and get 5, 6, 10% interest, greater than inflation. You can't do that anymore. You get like less than 1%, and inflation's greater than that. The reason for that is that every nation has central banks right now, and they're inflating the money supply, and so it destroys savings, it destroys poor people's ability to save, and it puts us in a speculative situation where we have to invest in stocks and bonds to try to get ahead, and that's very risky, and it's sinful. And it's because that they are printing money when they shouldn't. And so that goes back to just to help you understand what the problem
Russell,
is.
you went in before asking another question?
No, you should ask.
What would
another question.
have happened to American business culture if they were paying wages such that workers had a surplus that could be saved? What would happen? How could that possibly happen?
That's not the right question.
Why not?
The question is not whether they should be paying wages so that people could save.
Well, they have to be paid a surplus so that they might be able to save it, right?
Yes, they have to be paid, but they would be paying enough for the surplus if the system were balanced, okay? What you're heading for, and I hate to interrupt you,
No, go ahead.
but what you're heading for is the false logic of minimum wages. And that is false logic because what all that is an interference in microeconomic freedom, God's intended microeconomic freedom, just like that previous question where you were talking about taxes on robots. So once we start to pervert God's fundamental economy, once we start to disobey principles of subsidiarity with respect specifically to money and savings, I'm not even going to talk about anything else tonight. I won't bore you, but once we begin to violate that, guess what? We have to start fine-tuning everything else. Oh, well, this isn't working now because we violated that principle. So we'll put a tax on robots, and we'll come over here and we'll put a minimum wage so that people can live on and afford to live. And all of a sudden, guess what happens? We're micromanaging in the economy. Microeconomics cease to exist, and we all become
But at whatever
micromanaged.
But at whatever level of economy, James warns us that there will be people who will not pay fair wages.
There will
The
be people,
grievingness of the human heart is a factor.
and the reason that they won't pay fair wages is because, yes, they are greedy, but it also has to do with how they get away with not paying a fair wage. I'm saying, what I'm saying is that minimum wages, taxes on robots, and all the rest are the continuous stream of intervening to try and cover up a more fundamental basic sin. That's what I'm saying. And you're going to see them everywhere. And you're going to see people posit those as the answers to our problems, and they aren't the answers.
Doesn't minimum wage give employers the go-ahead to pay an unfair wage? I mean, a minimum wage isn't livable in this country right now. So, that's
Never meant to be livable.
I'm not disagreeing with that, and I'm not in favor of minimum wage. My point is, it gives employers the cover to pay an unfair wage.
Minimum wages cause unemployment and drive greater automation ahead of a schedule, before people are prepared for it, because it makes automation profitable. If you can't pay them a market wage, you have to pay them higher than market wage. Then they will go to automation first, where they wouldn't have before. So basically, that's part of what causes people.
Of course they would have gone to automation.
Eventually.
People who own firms are going to be looking to reduce their labor costs.
Not unless they can borrow the money at low interest rates.
Well,
Okay. Inflation of wage rates.
Look,
Go ahead, elaborate, brother.
Go ahead.
Can I say something? Well, in our business, which is a furniture business, a specialty business, we never paid minimum wage. We always paid more. Because we wanted to hire people who had already worked someplace or understood, we did not want the minimum wage worker. We wanted somebody better, that knew they had to come to work on time, that had some basic skills.
Why didn't every other firm operate that way?
Well, I think a lot do.
Okay, why doesn't?
They don't want to be the one to start the person at the bottom. But what we're doing with minimum wage is pricing that bottom out of the market, because unless you want an $8, $9 hamburger.
Mm-hmm. Why don't I want an $8, $9 hamburger?
What?
Why don't I want an $8 or $9 hamburger? What is so important about?
You can't afford that.
What's that?
A lot of people can't
You
afford
don't feed the
that.
poor man then.
They can't afford it because
One at a time, Brent, one at a time. Russell, you have the floor.
as always, I love Bob's contributions because I think that he is wrestling with really, really important issues. And I also think that the way he's putting those issues together takes us in a direction that is not at all helpful for the world in which we live in. I go back to my original comment about Keynes. Keynes was talking about the general facts of our experience. The general facts of our experience is that we don't want to pay $8 or $9 for a hamburger. We want a cheap burger. Why do we want a cheap burger? Well, partly it's because a lot of us have low incomes and we can't afford the big burger. But also it's just because we like the cheap burger. We like the deals. We like things to be cheap. We like them to be fast. We like them to be delivered quickly. That is the consumerist mentality. And we have gone through an industrial revolution. We have gone through the emergence of complex systems, of currency exchange, all in ways to maximize the ability of firms to be able to produce more at less cost, and by so doing, interfere with the ability of wage earners to save. The way I see it, when you talk about subsidiarity, obviously you're talking about an individual responsibility to save.
Right.
But also, where do you do that saving? How many people want to save money in the absence of the FDIC? Okay? It may be the case that the state should not do things that the individual should do, but the individual should not pretend that they can get along with doing the things that the state is supposed to be doing. There is a reason why shifts were made towards the macroeconomic world that you described, and I think it is entirely plausible to argue for some sort of microeconomic revolution and take us back to the sailing ships and the whale oil lamps and everybody working on the farm. But that also means taking away the medical technology and the communication technology and the diversity in the options that are before us all. We like the macroeconomic world because we are consumers that are driven to try to maximize all of these choices in front of us. So if we're going to talk about the responsibility of the individual versus the state, if we're going to talk about how people are going to save money and how you're going to protect labor, let's deal with the world of 2017 instead of,
Is the
world,
macro,
which I think it's a very entertaining world. It's not as entertaining as like Tolkien's map of Middle Earth.
Yeah,
but,
okay.
I think Bob reminds me of one of my teachers in graduate school, Phil Taylor, who was the staff economist during the Eisenhower administration. He said that the Eisenhower administration was kind of like a fellow with a headache who combs his hair. He's very close to the problem, but he's a heck of a long way from the solution. If money is the root of all evil, or money creation is the root of all evil.
the love of money, it says.
Well, I know, but I've got to change it a little bit to make it relevant to our discussion. It's much more subtle what its effect is. If you think about it, if credit is cheap, if I'm an investment banker, I could, perhaps finance some long-term physical project by investing in a company, but I think it's probably a lot more fun to create some new securities or to create some new financial assets. And if you look at how the economy's changed over the last 35 years, I did to produce one graph, it must have taken me a month and a half. The statistic stuff isn't as easy as you think.
No, I don't think it's easy. It's
But
tough.
what I did is I took the ratio of financial assets to physical assets in the economy. And if you go from the 40s up through the mid-80s, the financial assets might have grown 1/3% a year faster than, basically the ratio didn't change very much over time. There's not a lot of trend. From the mid-80s to the present, financial assets have grown 10% faster a year than have physical assets. And I think
Say that again, please.
financial assets have grown 10% a year faster than physical assets. Keeping them on the same terms. And then I won't go into the gory, geeky details of how to do that. Thank goodness, they say. And I think much of our problem is that we've given great incentives for the most clever people in our society to create esoteric securities and to come up with new ways of doing things financially rather than start new businesses. And it's little businesses in particular that create jobs.
That's right.
And that's where we're starving to death. This disproportion between finance, 4 of my 5 children, is it at this point, are in finance? 3 of my 5. Well, 3 of the 4 that are in the workforce are in finance. What have I done to the world?
Well, my daughter's an English major, so we're right there.
A couple of questions. Well, we have a lot of questions. You, sir, in the back, you had.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
To answer Mr. Love's question that he asked several times, savings comes from austerity, and then I'll move on to that. We went from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, and it was agriculture that freed us up time-wise. And then the reason where savings comes back into play is because of agriculture and the change in the seasons, we had to store the fruits of our labor because of the change of the season. So, and then one last thing I'll say, if we're debating whether or not to have calculators or not, calculators are obviously, we're not going to roll back time on that, and so we got to decide if that's the status quo. Are we arguing not to have calculators or to have calculators?
Can I answer?
Yeah.
You have any more, or can I answer that one first?
That's it.
Okay. You make a very good point. And I think the point that you made, you used the term rollback, right? Was that basically what Russell was saying? That it's impossible to roll back what we have. And I think maybe Malcolm, you sort of agree with that too. Am I correct?
Well, I think we've got all sorts of incentives that are distorting our decisions so that what we've got is not the natural outcome of market forces.
Okay, all right. So here's where we are, and I couldn't agree with you more. We have the choice before us is this. Either we return to microeconomic principles, right? And that is going to be extremely painful because we are addicted to macroeconomic solutions. And a lot of the people in this room are saying, oh, geez, we could never do that, okay? Well, guess what? I think that somewhere in the Catholic doctrine or the Christian doctrine, it says sin is not sustainable, right? So you return now or you return later. The sooner you return, the less painful it is. The longer you wait, the harder it gets. So that's one possible action that we could take, is to return, turn around. It's called repentance in Scripture, all right? And go back the other way, and it's not going to be pleasant. The other option is, and it's the only logical option, is the Bernie Sanders. You either get more conservative on your economics and return to principles, or you get more progressive on your politics and manage the outcomes any way that's necessary to try and bring about justice. And what you end up with the second scenario is collectivization, central planning, all kinds of things that will be even worse than what we think we have today. So,
Venezuela.
pardon me?
Modern Venezuela.
Or modern Denmark.
Or modern
where everybody has
Denmark.
died, right?
Yeah, no.
Because life is so bad there.
No, 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 no.
Pete,
Being the only politician I suspect in the group, I would like to clarify that there is a God-given rule for politics and government. However, in light of that misnomer that perhaps there is no rule for government, I would like to suggest perhaps that God has, the invisible hand has something to do with it. And I wonder what the panel feels. Why did God have us get twice as much manna on the sixth day? Or what is the purpose of Sabbath rest? And how does that interplay in economics?
I think it's a great idea.
I think it would be a wonderful thing if the governments of the world embraced the principle of the Jubilee.
Amen.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Mr. Stevens, did you have something? Did you? You had your hand up, sir.
I would just say that God is a capitalist. And if sin destroys capitalism, now that's too complicated for me to go any further, but if all these arguments and discussion, if you will put in God as a capitalist, you can see what he determines policy. And if we follow his principles, you have a element of success that you can't get any other way. If it's the invisible hand, then call it that.
Thank you, sir.
But it's still God's principle.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
I have a basic question. It has to do with natural resources, going to what you said, Bob, in your chart.
Yeah.
It seems to me that we have a population explosion geometrically to the point that we're no longer going to have enough natural resources for everybody on the planet to sustain their own life. So I ask you a question as a panel. What happens when we run out of the copper, iron ore, all the various elements we use for our smartphones? All the technology we're producing has to come from natural resources that are not sustainable. They aren't being replenished by God or by any other creation. So at what point do we reach a point of repentance, as you say?
Yes.
Having to go back to some fundamental ways to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves, to provide shelter.
We stop it when you and I stop consuming so much that we are taking away from our brothers and sisters. It stops being a problem when we're in solidarity with one another and we consider that your well-being matters. And I take care of you and I make sure that you have enough to live. But if I just consider that I have a right to consume as much as I want at the cost of others, then it isn't sustainable. It isn't sustainable if I have a right to consume as much as I want without any regard.
What you're
to you.
saying is Federal Reserve policy.
Well, no, I don't think
Why
it's
are they
Federal
pushing-
Reserve policy, Bob.
Well, they're
Dr.
pushing,
Chappell,
why are they
I would
pushing the interest
contest your
rate down,
premise.
Malcolm? Why did Keynes say, what was the problem with microeconomics? There wasn't enough aggregate demand.
Yeah, but
Is that true?
Beyond
His-
economics and talk
Doc-
about
yeah,
rainforests.
Dr.
Aggregate
Doc-
demand.
Dr. Chappell's talking about straightforward resources versus use.
Thank you.
And as I look at it, first of all, a natural resource, I guess I disagree with one of my panelists here, isn't a resource until humans value it. I mean, oil, when it was dug out of the ground in Pennsylvania, initially was considered a nuisance. Now it's considered valuable. Why? Because people have figured out things to do with it. And if I look around at the population statistics of the world, virtually every country of the world, the population, the birth rates and the reproduction rates are declining rapidly. In Europe, Italy, it's something like 1.2. You need 2.1 to have a stable population, much less grow. The United States has been bouncing near 2.
I have 3, so I'm doing my job.
Thank goodness. I did 5.
Why are they declining? Why are the
Thanks
rates
for having
declining?
one for me.
I'm just reporting this. I'm just this dumb
Well,
statistician.
no, I know, but why are they declining?
The
Why are the
declining
rates?
population rate's not this discussion. It's a sexual revolution discussion. Maybe that could be next month.
Did you have a
That
comment,
sounds
sir? Did you have a comment or
Yeah.
question?
To me, everything I see you guys talking about is that just government is out of its natural bounds. I mean, we need government.
Absolutely.
You have to have it. But look at it. Socialism has driven us into poverty. It's because why? Government can't manage social programs. It cannot be efficient in that. So you get the other thing, regulations. The reason why you're having to deal with this thing of artificial intelligence and robots is because government is trying to force a labor cost on the community
That's
that
not
it
true.
shouldn't have.
That's not true. There's been improvements in.
I'm all
there
for
have been
robots.
there have been improvements in technology since the beginning
Sure.
of time.
But,
Since the beginning of time, before governments were pushing their fingers on anybody.
but what I'm saying is the government
That's
is
not
the
why we
one
have-
that's the influencing factor.
I don't think that's true.
Oh, yeah.
I think that the influencing factor is
You
wanting
talk
to be
about
able to do
wages.
more.
You have to include the insurance that the government requires you to buy, the taxes that the government forces you to pay. Those are the wage costs. It ain't the $15 an hour they're wanting. It's the other $10 an hour government wants.
That's not the driving
Government
factor.
is outside its bounds of natural operation and forcing these situations. If they could,
Advancement is a natural part of the evolutionary process.
I'm all for advancement.
It doesn't have, and I'm as big of, I agree with you on the government being out of control perspective, but that's not the driving factor. It's a natural progression. Technology improvements are a natural progression.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between the rest of the world, the rest of history, and now is it's happening so much. We feel like it's happening so much faster. And I don't think that that's even necessarily the case. I think that economists could prove that advancements in technology aren't happening fast enough, actually. But I don't think it has anything to do, I don't think it has solely to do with the fact that government is forcing these situations. Would you agree?
Well, let's see. Let me come up with a concrete example. How much did the state of Kansas give Amazon to build that distribution center up in Kansas City? It was in the tens of millions. Was it 100 million? You mean the one that moved from Independence? That cost them 10 million down there? Oh, all I remember is that there was a very large number that was an incentive to Amazon to build it there. Now, 8-Day Books didn't get an incentive in order for them to open up, and I think they're the light shining in the world. Watermark Books didn't get an incentive to open up, much less keep their doors open. I'm much more of a tinkerer. Where are the places where we're distorting things, and let's come up with something nice and blanket that's even for everything. That's why I like a 20% value-added tax and get rid of the payroll tax and the corporate income tax.
How much would the state of Kansas have advanced to Amazon if interest rates were 10% and they had to borrow at 10% to get the money to lend it to Amazon?
Well, that's part of it, but the fact is that a big company will get an incentive, a little company won't. And that's the real tragedy of what's going on. Little companies have an unlevel playing field compared to big companies.
Which is unjust.
Ladies and
Okay.
gentlemen, it's
I'll do
8:30,
it.
and we'd like to observe the time. John, you've wanted to comment?
Well, I feel like we're in good hands with our Wichita City Council. Because we have people week after week coming to the well saying, we could create jobs if we didn't have to pay taxes like everyone else. So they take money from one group through force and give to another. And they do it under the guise of we're correcting market failures.
I think we.
I have one final question. You guys won't have very long to answer. Given the ongoing dispute between labor and capital, we can repent and go back. We can progress forward. How do you guys see us? How do you see this playing out? And however far you can see.
You mean before or after Donald Trump starts a war with North Korea?
That'll help the economy, right? Wars
That'll be a boom.
It
It won't be a very long war, unfortunately. So he's got to pick a fight with somebody who will last for a while.
Repentance or progression? How's it gonna play out?
I think that the thing that we have a problem with, like sitting here in 2017, is much like was discussed by Father and by members of the group is we've always been advancing, and at some point, obviously, because we're here, like that advancement became evil or sinful. And I would disagree with that premise. I think what the problem is throughout all of history, like when when Ford came out with the assembly line and interchangeable parts, and we were able to produce a automobile that anyone could own, we put blacksmiths and carriage makers and whip makers out of business. But we opened up entire industries, auto repair shops, motels, roadside cafes, construction companies that would have never existed. The problem we have is when the technology comes, and it's going to create more jobs, it always has, always. But you don't know what they are. You can't possibly fathom what the advancement in productivity and proficiency is going to allow you to do with the non-routine jobs that are left. So I don't think that there's really, I think this has probably been a discussion we've had throughout all of history on the whole. And it's always been that we found more jobs, there's something else to do. Robots can't do everything. And we'll move on, and we'll either get more efficient and wages will go up, or wages will be suppressed and we'll go into a depression or recession, which are words that you don't want to ever use. But
Thank you. Great answer, sir.
I'm in Ark City. It's probably a dying town in a lot of ways. The county's going to, I think Wichita State numbers said by 2040, basically the population of Cali County is going to be about half of what it is now. So I think we're about 35,000 people. I don't know. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. I just ask you to keep in mind the dignity of people. Keep in mind that each of us needs to be in solidarity with one another. We need to think about not just putting food on the table for those people, but giving them hope, giving them dignity, and giving them an ability to work, to do something, because they need that. And so, think about what you're doing in your life to reach out to those people, to help them to develop their own God-given humanity that they have.
Work is a vocation. It gives meaning to life. It creates society. It creates communities. Getting a lot of the people to work who are not working now and who don't show up in the unemployment rate is probably our greatest economic and social problem. And if you have a chance either to read Nicholas Eberstadt's book, Men Without Work, or for that matter, there's a video of a book forum they had at the Cato Institute of all places, where they he was one of the speakers and they had a couple of other speakers. I think, I don't know, I was in tears. It's a real, he'll bombard you with statistics, but if you put the flesh and blood on the statistics, it's a huge problem.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Who was the author?
Nicholas Eberstadt, Eberstadt. I would have to, I say,
She wrote a book on contraception.
yeah, she's a,
Something that I want to contribute to everyone here. This is from a book from Paul Sheen called Treasures in Clay. It's an autobiography. And it kind of ties in a lot of what everyone said tonight. Time has proved that it's not only the backs and the stomachs of the poor that have been affected by indigence. It is also the thinking of those teachers, even at times Christian thinkers, which perverted the very Christian truth which could help in liberation of the needy. By reducing theology to politics, by stressing social needs to the neglect of personal sin in the oppressor, by identifying Mark with Marx, they take all the air out of Christian trumpets which could call attention to the plight of the people.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you. Russell, Bob, closing comment.
I like both of Bob's options. I'm a fan of Wendell Berry, so I really don't think that a return of a repentance that would take us in the direction of greater localism, decentralization, DIYism, and a general return to the land and eschewing of much modern technology would be a bad thing at all. And I was also a strong supporter of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, and I actually don't think that the people of Denmark are all a bunch of cannibals that are eating each other to survive. So I kind of like both of Bob's options. Either one would be good, I suppose.
Thank you, sir. Bob?
My greatest fear is that neither of those options will be realized. And that what we will end up with, and if you want to understand why I think we will end up with it, there's a book called The Road to Serfdom, and it's written by a guy named F.A. Hayek. He wrote it after World War II to warn the West that the beginning of collectivized, centralized planning and economics would lead to fascism. And we are that close. We are that close. If the government did not have the ability to print money, we wouldn't be worried about all these wars. They don't have to worry about anything anymore. They do whatever they want. They're unfettered, and they're out of control. And I think in that kind of environment, unfortunately, we won't get either repentance or progressive policies. We will get fascism, and I think we're almost there right now.
Keynes wrote a glowing review of Road to Serfdom, which, by the way, was written during World War II.
Yes.
Unfortunately, he figured, we'll always have good, sensible people like me advising the government, so we'll be okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, a fundamental rhetorical principle guiding New Symposium Society is in a quote by Nancy Gibbs, senior editor of Time. She said, "Humility makes room for complexity and honors honest dissent." That's the goal of a New Symposium Society. Thank you for coming, and let's thank our panelists. Let's honor them. We'll do it as often as there's interest. Stay tuned. Thank you.